Tonight, we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
The evidence that points to the Ramseys, I think, is the fact that they were in the house at the time of the murder.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're looking at Burke Ramsey appearing on Dr. Phil, and we're going to look at his body language, his demeanor, the things that he says, the context, and then also the interesting aftermath. So he gives these interviews, and then there's kind of a backlash. There's a lot of social media reaction to everything, and Dr. Phil then needs to do some, whatever you want to call it, damage control or provide his assessment. Now, a couple of days ago, about 5 or 6 days ago, another creator covered this, and I was interested to see what he found, what he looked at, and I must say I was quite disappointed. I was disappointed that I disagreed with upwards of 80% of what he spoke about, and I was also disappointed that it was almost wall-to-wall support of what he was saying. And so I don't think it's really, I don't want to make it between what he says and what I say and who's the bigger expert. I think it's interesting how someone can look at the same thing and not see something or see things completely differently. And it's obviously you guys who are out there, who don't have a horse in the race, you guys aren't creators. It's up to you guys to look at his analysis, look at my analysis and go, I wonder who's more informed. I think I agree with that one on that thing and that one on that thing. But what is always useful where you have analysis that is not accurate, I think it reminds you of what is likely to be the case. And as an example of that, I always enjoy the Lifetime movies that come out dramatizing the events. And I'll tell you why I like it. It's because you realize why a version of events is unlikely when it's dramatized and you're watching it and you're going, wow, that really doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that the Lifetime movie tends to provide almost a vanilla version, the obvious version of, if you skim through all the information, well, it's going to give you that. And so it also gives you a sense of, I won't say the fake news version, but a sort of a version that, I guess the mainstream, it's the obvious version. And then it also makes you realize what is the obvious version and what's the not obvious version, and which one is more likely as well. So if you do want to catch my analysis of the other creators, look at the body language. He basically restricted himself very much to the expressions and so on. You can head on to patreon.com/TCRS. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started.
As to why I'm doing it now. It's the 20th anniversary, and there's apparently still a lot of attention around it.
Let's hold up for a moment. So, Dr. Phil asks Burke why he's doing this interview now, and I think it's a great question. I don't know if I think the answer is very likely. I think the answer sounds appropriate. The answer sounds right. But I don't know if I agree with it. And so the question is, why is he doing it now? And he says, well, it's the 20th anniversary. Well, it was not quite the 20th anniversary. The Dr. Phil show, I think, aired on the 12th of September 2016. And I think there were 3 episodes in all. I think there was another episode on the 14th of September, and then a final one on the 16th of September. I could be wrong with those dates, but it is basically through the middle of September that Burke went on to Dr. Phil. And so I think what is quite interesting to consider is, well, if it's the 20th anniversary, then why is it not being done on the 20th anniversary? In other words, on Christmas Day. Why do it in September? Right? It's not even in December. Why do it then? You might say, well, they can do it whenever they want to. Well, I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. The case of John Bonet, which also aired on CBS, so Dr. Phil is on CBS, and the case of John Bonet also on CBS, right? But the case of John Bonet, which focused on Burke ultimately, interestingly enough, aired on the 19th of September and then also the 20th of September. And something that I think is very much forgotten, very much something that is just petered out of the narrative is, do you remember the case of John Bonet Ramsey was supposed to be 3 episodes? There was the first episode, which is 2 hours, then a second episode, and then it was going to culminate in a third episode with a total time of 6 hours. And a friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles, I think a school friend of hers, someone that she went to school with, he was part of the production. So she kind of had the inside track on that. Anyway, what we know now is that that third episode never aired. It sort of was culled. And we'll deal with that in more detail in episode 49, the penultimate episode in the series. So this is my opinion. So when Burke is asked, why are you doing this now? Why are you going in front of the cameras now for the very first time in 20 years? Why are you going in front of the cameras in mid-September 2016? And Burke answers, well, there's still a lot of speculation, and it's a 20-year anniversary. I don't believe that. I don't think that's the full explanation for why it was the case. It could be, but I think another possible reason could be strategic, is that this documentary was about to come out and perhaps certain interests wanted to get in front of it. Bear in mind, it wasn't just Burke who appeared in the documentary. It was also his father, also the Ramsey lawyer, and some other people as well. Lawrence Schiller was also on. The voice you heard at the beginning was Trip DeMuth, a former, I think a prosecutor who was employed by the Boulder Police Department at one stage, and he then later on became a prosecutor. And you hear him speaking on CBS right at the beginning on Dr. Phil, just saying, oh, well, I think the reason the family were suspects was simply because they were in the house. Do you really agree with that? I mean, the ransom note was suspicious. The circumstances around the ransom note were suspicious, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So it's just quite funny how the Dr. Phil, the timing of it, but also to some extent the content of it, Burke is sort of asked, because I think people would also be wondering, why are you doing this now? And Burke then, quote unquote, sets the record straight. I believe that he did this to get in front of the CBS documentary. And you might say, well, the CBS documentary was going to ultimately, I guess, point a finger at Burke or accuse Burke. And remember, there was subsequently a $750 million lawsuit against that documentary, and also the third episode was shut down, right? So that's the one aspect. But I think we've got to be specific and say, well, what in that documentary was A, damaging, or B, of concern, or C, something that was worthy of some kind of intervention, some kind of action, right, by Team Ramsey. And obviously this is just speculation on my part. I could be completely wrong. It's possible that Burke Ramsey was going to do the interview all along. It's possible that it's got nothing to do with what I'm saying. So I'm just giving my opinion on this. But something that I don't think I'd ever seen before, and bear in mind, I was researching the Ramsey case at the time. I was going through all the material that I could find at the time. And so one of the things that came out of the CBS documentary was these audio video clips. There's not very great quality, but certainly quite something that was almost completely new, that many of us had never ever seen before. These video clips of Burke as a little boy, 2 different sessions, being asked questions and responding in a way that didn't always seem particularly convincing, that sometimes seemed strange. And some people will scoff and say, well, the fact that he didn't draw his sister doesn't really mean anything. You know, a week or 2 after she died, the fact that he didn't draw her means nothing. Well, maybe it does, it's possible, but in a lot of other cases with a lot of other children, when they've done the same thing, it's not the case. They still draw the absent person as part of the group. And something else that is interesting is often the extended group, the extended community of children, when asked to draw pictures of the class or whatever, would also draw this person that's no longer there. So it's not just to do with a sibling, it's to do with that kind of thing. I think another way of thinking about it is, if you as an adult were asked to draw your family, and someone had recently died, would you not acknowledge them? You might say, well, an adult would think that way, but what about a child? What about a child if just the day earlier or whatever the child's dog had died? Would the child not acknowledge that, because it ought to be foremost in their mind? Would they not acknowledge that in the picture? And you might say, children can forget the past very quickly as a way of coping. I'm simply saying that something that was groundbreaking in the Dr. Phil episode was this content of Burke as a very little as a little boy, and it was certainly odd to some people, the things that he said in both interviews, what he said about the pineapple, what he said about I know what happened to John Bonet, and now here he is 20 years later, and it's still causing people to raise their eyebrows. And I don't think it's because there's a witch hunt. I don't think people are jumping on the bandwagon. I don't think they are looking at something where there's nothing there. I think it's quite clear that Burke is nervous. The question is he nervous because he's led an unusual life, or is he nervous for some other reason? And the creator on the other channel was basically echoing what Dr. Phil said, basically just taking a leaf out of his book, saying, well, he's simply smiling because he's nervous. And there's nothing more to it than that. And that's also something that Dan Abrams said. I want to play a quick clip of Dan Abrams on Good Morning America, ABC, giving his assessment of Burke Ramsey in this interview. Let's listen in.
Be here.
Good to see you. Let's start with Burke Ramsey. He was giving that interview to Dr. Phil. Been under a cloud for so long, telling him what it was like to be considered as a suspect in his sister's death. But, hadn't been under this cloud even though DNA evidence cleared him.
He wasn't a real suspect. I know a lot of people are going to be very frustrated to hear this, particularly after watching episode 2 of Dr. Phil's interview. He was never a real suspect. He's not a real suspect now. And this interview is making him seem like a suspect. He was 9 years old at the time. Remember that. There are questions being asked of him of, well, when this happened, why didn't you say this? And why didn't you include John Bonet in a picture? And you know what? Because he was 9 years old at the time. 9-year-olds. And that's another thing. By the way, if Burke Ramsey had committed this crime when he was interrogated at age 9, you don't think he would have cracked back at the time?
So a lot of emphasis there on him being 9 years old. In fact, he was a couple of days away from being 10 years old. The other thing that I think is interesting about this is this whole thing that he was never a suspect. Now, on the one hand, you could say, yes, it's true, he was never a suspect. If he was never a suspect, then why would his lawyer, Lynn Wood, write a letter to the District Attorney Alex Hunter, and this is in October, asking him to confirm that Burke isn't a suspect and was never a suspect? And this letter, he almost wanted a sort of blanket statement that he was never a suspect, the police never investigated him, kind of thing. And although the district attorney signed this letter, so the letter was drafted with the whole thing, with all the details. It's actually in Paula Woodward's book, if you want to go and read it yourself. Actually, is it in Paula Woodward's book? I think it's in Kolar's book. So let me just get the page in Kolar's book. It's page 495 and 496 and 497 and 498. And then I think he talks about it somewhere in his book as well. So you can go and check that out in his book. If he was not a suspect and it was ridiculous that he was ever a suspect, then first of all, I don't know why his lawyer would need to draft this letter in so many details with 10 separate paragraphs. I also don't know why the district attorney would redact certain sections of it that he felt was kind of a little bit giving him too much leeway. And what is interesting is in interviews on The View and also on Dr. Phil, there's an acknowledgement that they were considered suspects. Now, I suppose you could make the technical argument that there's a difference between people, the public, thinking of them as suspects and the police considering them suspects, like officially. I think if you want to go down that route, you could basically say, just in a very broad way, you could say, if you look at Steve Thomas's book, it doesn't seem to pay too much attention to Burke. There is a little bit of description of him giving these interviews with Suzanne Bernard and Dan Schuller. And then there's also Kolar. And Kolar, I think, was... I don't know if he was employed by Boulder Police Department. He was certainly working for Mary Lacey. But he was basically given access to the Boulder Police case file and so on. And he came to the conclusion that he came to. So in other words, according to a detective who worked on the case, Burke was a legitimate suspect, according to Kolar. And then they made the CBS documentary to quite a large extent based around Kolar's theory. And then we know what happened to that. But again, if there was absolutely nothing to it, if it was just a silly rumor, then why even go on to Dr. Phil? If there's not really anything to defend, then why even bother? I do think it's common sense, and it's something that, as I say, Trip de Muth references early on, where he says, obviously the family would be suspects because they were in the house at the time. So when you're going to make this claim that he was never a suspect, I think is a little bit simplistic, because we don't know who was in the house for sure, but we also do know who was in the house for sure, right? So I want to spend a bit more time dealing with the actual interview with Dr. Phil. I have, as I say, dealt with it on Patreon, just looking at what this other creator noticed and saw, and how I've come to a different conclusion. So you can check that out on Patreon. Head on to patreon.com/TCRS.
Speak out now after all these years. I think it was a mistake in retrospect, in particular watching him, right? He seems to almost have like a little smile.